Well, we can probably get started, Anne.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Glad you're here for this edition of Husky Highlights. Today we'll be hearing from Jennifer Atkinson and Rachel Schur, who were awarded SRCP grants. And we'll kick off with Jennifer. Jennifer Atkinson. Dr. Jennifer Atkinson is with the school with IAS, and the title of her talk is an Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. Jennifer.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hope everybody can see my screen. Let me know if you can't, because I do have quite a few slides I'm going to be sharing. This is a book that well, first I should say I want to thank the SRCP grant committee and those who made these funds available, because the course release I got to do this was absolutely essential in getting it up to this stage. Trying to edit a book with 30 contributors was like, I thought, oh, this was going to be easier than writing my own book, which is what I've done, only one book in the past. And I had to do all the research myself, but it turns out that's actually easier than trying to coordinate the research of 30 different people. So I'm not doing this alone. I am co-editing it with Sarah Jaquette Ray, who is at Humboldt State University. And as I mentioned, it's going to feature about 30 different contributors when the book is out. We recently got a contract from University of California Press. And the project deals with eco-grief and climate anxiety and other difficult emotions that students and educators face in environmental classrooms. I'm sure you've all probably heard these terms thrown around, but climate anxiety is not just a trendy Seattle tree hugger thing. It is that as well. But the research shows that it is truly a global phenomenon. A little over a year ago, the largest research study ever done on mental health impacts of climate change for young people showed just widespread psychological distress. This was published in The Lancet after the team surveyed over 10,000 teens from across the world. So Nigeria, Finland, Australia, India, Brazil, the Philippines, here in the US as well. And 56% of youth who responded said that they believe humanity is doomed. It's like this very dark cloud over this generation. 45% said climate anxiety disrupts daily activities like sleeping, focusing on schoolwork. 1 in 4 are afraid to have children, and 77% said the future is frightening. But for me personally, I didn't actually need this report to know that something was going on with my own students. And in fact, this book project largely emerged from my personal experience of being a climate educator and seeing the hopelessness and despair among my students dramatically increase here at UW, like just in the past 7 or so years. So on this slide, you'll see these are quotes from the first day of a class last year where I asked students, how do you feel when you imagine the future? And it is so consistently dark. You'll see here, I feel hopeless, useless, and minuscule. Why even bother bringing children into an already dying world? That one on the very bottom of the left-hand column, seeing the planet break down has made me break down. And this is just across classes that I teach and students that I ask about this. So in response to this pattern, I actually launched a class here in IAS back in 2018 on climate anxiety and eco-grief, and I now teach that every year. But about 2 years into that work, I was just connecting with more and more educators who were also looking at this problem. So I partnered with Sarah Jaquette Ray to co-host a conference where we ended up bringing together 29 international scholars and educators just to share teaching strategies for addressing this. And there was so much interest beyond our group. First, we posted it on a website, but we just kept getting queries. And so we decided to publish a book featuring those tools. So I mentioned the book's origins in that conference. It was more like a seminar because it was 30 of us. But I mentioned that because I really do want to be clear that this collection simply represents a snapshot of the experiments in teaching that people in our network have been exploring. It is not like a canon of best practices. It is certainly not comprehensive or exhaustive. Our goal is simply just to draw attention to the necessity of bringing these themes of climate, emotion, and justice all together in the classroom, and then share at least what people in our particular group have been doing. So to wade into this, I'm going to read the first page or two from the introduction. This is still in draft form, but I think it gives a snapshot of what we're doing. Despite immense concern and public support of local, national, and global policies to address climate change, despite scientific consensus about the problems and the availability of large-scale solutions, and despite mounting urgency over the timeline for mitigation, not enough is being done, and progress seems elusive in response to this wicked problem of our time. Consequently, climate leaders are starting to recognize what Indigenous thinkers, psychologists, and social movements have long known. The key is a shift in cultural mindsets and values. Even the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as of this writing, recommends an inner transition to create the conditions for the energy revolution required to curb climate change's worst effects. This effective turn, as is commonly known in academic circles, is reshaping the climate movement. Emotions, values, mindsets, the psyche, and matters of the heart are the new solar panels, technologies required to set into motion the extant solutions and public will. This collection seeks to advance the shift in thinking about what is needed to address what many have called the greatest existential threat of our time. Specifically focused in the area of higher education, we believe that this moment requires a long overdue radical change in what we do in the classroom. It is no longer morally or strategically appropriate to berate students with dire forecasts and reports of the sixth grade extinction, to teach case studies of slow violence and ecological destruction, or present problems so deep and entrenched that solutions appear futile. With students coming into the classroom already aware of how bad things are, the old model of scaring them into caring is no longer working. Even worse, it's backfiring, as shown by a growing body of scholarship on the role of emotions in climate action. In Living in Denial, Kari Norgaard demonstrates that the information deficit assumption of most environmental messages, which maintains that people and systems will change when they hear enough climate facts, is a myth. Instead, apathy is the most likely result of these doom-focused messages, as demonstrated by climate psychologists like Renee Lertzman. Even if pro-social, pro-environmental, and activist behavior are the initial response to the fear and urgency peddled in most climate messages, the longer-term costs to the planet and ourselves of climate anxiety are well documented. Environmental melancholia, ecophobia, degradation, desensitization, and other emotion words are emerging to explain how the apocalyptic approach to climate messaging is undermining mitigation efforts. If psychologists and climate communication experts know that piling on the doom makes us feel powerless, despairing, skeptical, and apathetic, why are so many of us still teaching this way? Oops. And then the last paragraph from this introduction. One fundamental premise of this collection arises from the insight that many educators have come to. Emotions shape not only students' capacity for learning, but also their ability to respond meaningful to what they're learning. Most environmental educators want students to feel inspired, to engage in sustained action over the course of their lives in service of climate justice, environmental protection, and personal and societal healing. And most educators are aware that we're at a turning point in education, accelerated by the pandemic, and that these times require new or ancient, depending on how you look at it, theories, narrative experts, pedagogies, and skills. But few climate educators are aware of what emotion experts, affect theorists, narrative experts, psychologists, and students of most wisdom traditions and social movements all know, that the key to these healing outcomes is not logic, information, data, or facts, but emotion. This book brings the most up-to-date research on climate emotions to bear on climate pedagogy. And I just want to add that another argument for centering emotions in climate pedagogy is that educators themselves are exhausted, overwhelmed, often wrestling with climate emotions like despair and apathy and anger. So these resources are really to help us on both ends of that equation. And the contributors to the book ended up including folks from a lot of different disciplines, climate communication, science, media studies, psychology, the arts, games and game theory, liberatory pedagogy, and a lot more. But despite the different disciplinary backgrounds and methods, there was a common set of challenges that we saw emerge across these chapters. And I won't read all of these. The second bullet point is one that was really important. Are we prepared to do the slow work of cultivating relationships and equitable processes required to address inequality on the way and is fundamental to addressing climate change? So this is a question of the kinds of communities that we create in our classroom as being the laboratory for what we want to see out in the world. The second to last bullet point, this is a really important one. How can educators help students imagine thriving in a climate changed world? How can we help students desire rather than fear their future? And finally, how can educators do the work without doing further harm to themselves or to others? So I'm going to share a couple of sample chapters and highlight some points from the different contributors that we got. The chapters that we have, some of them cover theory, others are just very actual practical tools or classroom activities. The first one is a pretty easy introductory level activity. And I like it because it actually comes from a STEM educator who says, well, look, I don't do psychology or emotions, and yet here she is. As she mentions in the slide, to effectively address such eco-anxiety or climate anxiety in students and empower them to meaningful actions, educators must not just teach disciplinary content, but inspire hope, optimism, and cultivate coping mechanisms to promote relational learning and connectedness to community. How can we do this, recognizing that by and large, science faculty, including me, are not trained to confront psychological distress among their students, let alone support them through it? So Pratt developed a module with 3 parts where students, they consider and they write about emotional responses to these wicked problems. Then they have a structured and supportive classroom discussion. And then that this module ends with them committing to meaningful action to issues that matter to them. On the left are some readings, assigned readings that she offers. And then for this pre-class reading and reflective journal, students just consider questions, and these are the ones that are on the right, where they really start to discover that while they maybe weren't consciously aware of it and have never talked about this perhaps in a STEM class, they do indeed feel really intense distress. These are feelings that go unacknowledged because we don't make space for those conversations. Until recently, we didn't even really have vocabulary to name things like eco-grief. So that act of naming and recognizing them just is a crucial first step to normalizing those feelings and helping them recognize them as, in fact, healthy reactions to a very intense issue. And students can respond either through a journal or discussion thread, but the author is very emphatic about there is a real advantage to public discussion posts because they create this space for affirmations and supportive comments and a kind of camaraderie that emerges. And that enhances participation when students later come to class because they arrive knowing that their feelings are indeed shared by their peers. And then the next part is the in-class discussion. This can really be adopted for different case, or instructors can use different case studies and examples, whatever's going to be relevant to that class's local context. And the author includes a URL. I can drop this in the chat towards the end to download her presentation and material and slides. So this is just, again, very kind of introductory, just opening up a space for that conversation. And then they're placed in groups of 4 or 5 to share reflections, build community and support. The prompts here are listed at the bottom. And finally, the session, as I noted, concludes with this action planning tool, which guides students towards some form of concrete engagement. And specifically, it's not like just something generic, like I see everybody else going to a protest, so I'm going to go to a protest, but it helps them think through, I think there's a chart on this, their purpose, the outcome, and the process for their intervention. And this is another moment where it's more effective if students share that commitment with the class at the end, because that makes it easier to see how these individual commitments do add up to substantial collective change. There's a personality quiz that goes with this as well. There's some really good ones out there now that are linked to different ways people can get involved in climate action. And so we'll be featuring some of those in the book. So that's probably the most like introductory level assignment we've included. There's a variation on it that I like, this other chapter called the emotional impact statement. And this grew out of a series of conversations that Christy Manning and Susan Koger had with students at Macalester College, where students would discover that a stand of trees where they played as a kid had been converted to a storage facility, or maybe they learned that health problems in their own family were linked to polluting industries. And then over the course of investigating the legal and regulatory processes that approved those projects, so the one that we're familiar with being the environmental impact statement, the students themselves kind of brought up this oversight. And as one of them wrote in that quote at the top, apparently the environmental impact statement didn't take into consideration the emotional impact of losing those trees or harming those families. So that's how this statement came about in their teaching. So it's once again kind of meant to call attention to the psychological dimensions of economic and development practices. And so the authors write, if the environmental impact statement is analytical, neutral, and detached in describing damage to natural and human communities, the emotional impact statement invites feelings to be acknowledged, expressed, shared, and processed. But the book also goes beyond. I wanted to start off kind of with this like grief and anxiety, because we do go beyond that and cover emotions that get less attention, like playfulness and even joy. Our contributor, Peter Frederici, writes about comedy, which he sees as a corrective to the dominant genre in climate representation, which is, of course, tragedy. In this excerpt, he writes, tragic literature is also characterized by what Frank Kermode dubbed the sense of an ending, meaning that its narratives achieve cohesive meaning only through the existence of a conclusion that defines and stitches together the story, an ending that is foreordained by the narrative's author, even if readers only discover its meaning when they get to the end. Prevailing climate change narratives feature numerous such predetermined endings. And the box on the right gives examples that we see in climate discourse, both those that are hopeful and that are very doom-oriented. So whether it's the narrative of the techno fix swooping in, or the inevitability of capitalism, or religious traditions of apocalypse, which has now really kind of been taken up by conventions of Hollywood film. And the common strand of tragedy that links all of these narratives is that sense of inevitability that has characterized tragedy since the ancient Greeks in the kind of mode that he's writing it. So Frederici writes, once the story starts running, its course cannot be altered. No wonder young people are anxious. And so a lot of this chapter actually draws from the literature scholar and naturalist Joseph Meeker, who over 50 years ago suggested that tragedy in literature grows from the same seedbed of belief that has led us into the ecological crisis, especially through the focus on individualism and division between humans and the rest of nature. Of course, Meeker's work predated widespread knowledge of climate change, but the summary still resonates today. So in a nutshell, Frederici asks, what would happen if we drew instead on tragedy's foil, on comedy, to develop alternative climate change narratives? And again, he draws on Meeker's analysis, which finds in comedy, quote, kinship with the myriad unpredictable ways in which biological evolution has allowed life to persist and flourish in the face of innumerable environmental challenges. Like evolution, Meeker writes, comedy is concerned with muddling through, not with progress or perfection. So here are kind of the corollaries in comedy, or the comic mode. And he's makes the point that, comedy does not necessarily equate with humor. It really is centering on this practice of breaking down barriers, disrupting hierarchies, and finding unexpected means of advancing the story, right? Just as evolution can result in adaptations that couldn't have been predicted in advance. With that said, though, funny comedy does actually have potential for contributing to climate conversations. And he cites research by Boykoff and Osnes, who describe a series of climate-themed comedy performances and competitions that students participated in at the University of Colorado. And what they found was students reported higher levels of efficacy and engagement as a result of their participation. So Frederici is just one example, I think, in a line along here. If you're, especially the one on the left, if you're familiar with Nicole Seymour's book, Bad Environmentalism, which is fabulous. It's so highly recommended. She argues that, these familiar affects that characterize environmentalism, the ones that we all associate, like awe, love, guilt, reference, grief and mourning now, earnestness. Yeah, those are the sort of the dominant tropes, and any emotions that deviate from that repertoire in environmental discourse are often deemed unacceptable. But the problem is, of course, those sentiments turn a lot of people off from environmentalism, and the very tone of the movement traditionally has been regarded as sanctimonious, self-righteous. I'm as guilty as anybody in creating that characterization. So Seymour's work looks at what happens when we confront these very serious environmental problems through unserious texts and methods. So she looks at books and films and other cultural products that very much flout that solemn tone and draw on affects like playfulness and irreverence and irony. So that's a great companion text if any of Frederici's ideas resonate. Other writers that Frederici highlights in this chapter are these intersectional stories sampled in Walida Amarisha and Adrienne Marie Brown's anthology, Octavia's Brood. Interestingly enough, that's a great one to adopt this year because our library is using that as one of the common books and has discussion groups and questions around it. So there's already some structure in place for that, as well as the one on the far right, Ursula Le Guin, and the call for feminist-centered environmental storytelling. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Okay, I'm gonna maybe see if I can highlight two others. We have another one by Marek Oziewicz. This is looking specifically at guilt, and it outlines a class activity that encourages students to consider how individuals have come to accept climate guilt that is actually caused, for a destruction that's caused by systemic drivers and not really individual choices. He's careful not to suggest that individual choices are inconsequential, but he's very concerned about how students get crushed by climate guilt and then end up accepting climate change as a kind of punishment for being personally implicated as one of its drivers. And research has repeatedly shown that guilt is very ineffective for working towards climate injustice or climate justice. It actually makes people shut down or withdraw. People want to shrink back from visibility when they feel guilt, and that leads them to disengage. Opposite of what we want. When we're consumed by guilt or shame, we can also be very tempted to focus on alleviating our own personal discomfort rather than addressing the source of the problem. But despite all that research, guilt is still like one of the most widely used strategies in environmental messaging. And so we've got this generation of students who've grown up swimming in this guilt narrative. But the strange part, according to Oziewicz, is that students do actually have a strong understanding that structures and processes like capitalism and colonialism are at the root of the crisis. And this is borne out in surveys that he's conducted with students over the past 8 years, as well as broader research as well on what students know. It shows that the vast majority of them will identify climate breakdown as a kind of a continuation of the extractive logic set in motion by European colonization. And so they know that it is something that's the fault of a particular group of people who have not been held accountable for their actions. So that's what students know on an intellectual or academic level. But on a affective, emotional level, that personal sense of guilt and self-loathing still remains unshakable. So Oziewicz writes, here then is the accountability paradox. The more students learn about the ecocidal operations of neoliberal capitalism, the easier it is for them to misremember ecocide as nobody's fault. So the inevitable price of technological process, or is everybody's fault, i.e. responsibility shared by everyone who participates in the system. This menu of two options is false, part of the neoliberal legitimizing discourse. In each case, the misremembering generates disempowering emotions, including in the former, the cognitive dissonance of feeling guilty that nobody appears to be held accountable for what science clearly identifies as a human-driven damage to the planet. In my experience, the sense of guilt is even more pronounced when students acknowledge their complicity in the ecocidal system, embracing the everybody's fault framework. Their climate guilt is then an expression of doing my part. It builds on young people's sense of fairness and communicates their readiness to shoulder the blame for the sorry state of the planet, even if they are unable to take other constructive action. In fact, and perversely so, guilt is a powerful substitute for constructive climate action, all the more so because it appears to be a form of action too. And by the way, I thought it was interesting that his research has shown that the sense of guilt is actually pervasive among BIPOC students as well as white students. Even though they experience climate guilt and climate impacts very differently, they are all conditioned by this decades-long rhetorical campaigns meant to confuse them into misremembering who's responsible for the climate crisis. So I won't go into the details of what he does in the class, but there's a set of readings basically that just help them start off by seeing how their climate guilt is manufactured and continuing to return to that. And then the last one I thought it would be a good one to end with is joy. So we have Casey Meehan's chapter, which looks at the way that play nourishes mental well-being. So it activates the reward and social centers in the brain. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen these headlines around, brain scans bear this out. First, that during play, our brain releases dopamine associated with joy and creativity. So this is just a really welcome antidote in an age where anxiety and depression are so much on the rise. But then second, he points out that play connects us to others. So this is both on a physiological level where playful interactions trigger release of oxytocin, which generates connection and feelings of trust. And also psychologically, it's a vehicle for attunement. So for accepting people where they are without shame or judgment. And feeling accepted oneself. And then the third benefit is it gives a space to explore new ways of acting and being in the world. So besides lifting our spirits so that we're emotionally resourced to do this hard work, why else might we need play in climate education? And Meehan writes, play is seen as separate from the real world since players experiment with different rules, norms, and/or roles. In this imaginary world of play, we can test and retest our understanding of a situation, learning about how tweaks to our alternative universe impact how we feel, how we perform, and how the game turns out. In the process, we spur creative solutions to problems that arise. Indeed, as the late play expert Bernie DeKoven wrote, we play our way to understanding. And one example that he offers is the UN climate change conference simulation. This is available to anybody for free through C Roads. The platform was developed by Climate Interactive, and it allows players to negotiate, and you can try different strategies, and you learn about the range of issues and different impacts on different regions in the world. And all of the elements of choice are used very playfully. So you can go to their website and apply that anytime. This is the dashboard that you see as a player. And as you make different decisions, the temperature increase goes up and down. And so, Meehan concludes that, in the face of this climate challenge, we cannot be afraid to try and to fail with new ideas and regenerative ways of being with each other. And he writes in the chapter, play benefits our mental health, connects us to others, spurs creativity, gives us permission to fail, and gives us practice at being brave. But I suspect what attracts us to play is that it just feels good. When we play fully, we feel renewed and ready to face the challenges we're up against. So maybe I'll stop talking there so we have time. But I'll leave this last slide up. I did have another one, but I feel like I have till 11:45. Is that right? This is a chapter on poetry. So for our humanities people out there, a little shout to all of us. Can you confirm, Anne, what it was? You said 11:45?
Yes, you have until 11:45.
Okay. Maybe I'll just say one thing then about this particular chapter to kind of segue into the Q&A. This is a instructor who talks about how emotional alienation, she talks about the emotional alienation that students feel in engaging with climate change, and particularly in academia with our like hyper intellectualized, hyper specialized spaces, and sees poetry as a corrective to it. And there's just a nice rubric and set of prompts to use any poem that one might want in any type of class, even and especially STEM classes or other classes with no engagement with the literary arts and the humanities. And she lists these 4 things that poetry helps to encourage. And the poem that she features in our book is Ode to Dirt by Sharon Olds, partly because it calls out the problem of alienation very specifically by exploring our failure to recognize networks of independence that sustain us, and also kind of thinking about both elements and people and social groups that are made invisible, that are othered through hierarchies, et cetera, and trying to sort of celebrate these common elements as a way to call attention to some of those structural imbalances. So this is her conclusion of why use poetry. She says, college students often see poetry as intimidating or irrelevant, but helping them experience poems as living documents applicable to contemporary lives can yield surprising moments of dialogue, openness, and creativity. So that's just a snapshot of some of the chapters we're putting in here. It's pretty overwhelming. Like I've forgotten like half of the stuff that's going into the book at this point. But I tried this actually presentation. I'm really grateful that I was scheduled to do this, because it helped me to kind of organize some of this material and go back and just refamiliarize myself with what we've got and what we're putting in the book.
Okay, well, with that, I'll open the floor to questions and to Q&A. If you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask it.
I have a question.
Rachel.
Jennifer, I'm so excited about what you presented, and having nothing to do with the project that I'm presenting on today in the second half. I'm working with high school teachers in a professional development setting to help them integrate equity into the teaching and learning of energy in physics. And climate topics come up a lot. And so I'm just these are just seems like your book is going to be an incredible resource. It seems like it's probably mostly intended for work with undergraduates, but it seems like it would be so appropriate for high school teachers and their students also. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and I think we were really worked hard and continue to work really hard with our contributors. First of all, I think we tried to make it so interdisciplinary that in that process, it became also, I think, appropriate for students in high school as well as college. And what I mean by that is, we're really working deliberately with the contributors to be able to speak to, for example, if you're a humanities educator, to give tools that people in STEM can use, and vice versa. And so because we sort of tried to make it as accessible as possible, I really think that it's appropriate for high school students as well.
Okay. Jen, you have a question?
Hi, yes, I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry for not being on video. I'm actually in a car right now.
Yeah.
Hi, Jen. I loved that talk, and I'm so excited about the project. And I have I think we have often left the teaching of climate change to our more environmentally capable colleagues, right? And folks who are actually experts in the field. And I think part of the reason for that, besides our lack of expertise, has been our fear of putting that onto students while we're also asking them to think about racial capitalism and the way that white supremacy and racial violence still structure the world, et cetera, et cetera. But lately, I've been really excited by the work of folks who are thinking about climate coloniality and thinking about abolition and climate justice, people like Julie C. And there are lots of other folks, right? And I'm wondering if you and your colleagues have found that actually using that kind of lens to approach climate change is also part of this project of like creating a different kind of affective response, because I think it can potentially allow students to think like, oh, wait, all of these problems that we are naming are also intertwined with one another fundamentally, right? And so approaching them is going to mean actually using different kinds of lenses for understanding them. Does that make sense?
100%. Yes. Yeah, we have a couple. Well, actually, my co-author or the co-editor, Sarah Jaquette Ray, has been doing a ton of work on ecofascism and white fragility around climate emotions and climate despair in this last year or so. So, like the fingerprints of that kind of work is really evident in the book, as well as one of our contributors, April Anson, who has a fabulous teaching tool. It's called the Eco-Fascist Creep. And it's a way of kind of responding to these moments that come up in the classroom where students, their own kind of environmental impulses are sort of very, in very troubling ways, tending towards these kind of fascist ideologies. And so she like gives these tools that actually help students to make that visible. And so, and yeah, this is stuff that's like, gosh, if you're like a science educator, or you're like atmospheric work on these issues, like just do not have the tools for addressing this kind of stuff. But I think that's where the piece of kind of starting with like climate emotions has been really generative, because, so for example, there's been really interesting debates on whether climate anxiety is a white thing. And there were some interesting articles last year. And then it's very clear from like the global scope of the Lancet study I shared at the beginning, there's a ton of research showing that it's not. In fact, Black and Latinx people in the US are statistically more concerned about climate breakdown, as well as people in poorer countries in the global South. But the question always depends, and this is one of the things we want educators to think about, is like, what do you mean by climate anxiety? Is it an abstract fear about future loss? Or is it something more like actual trauma from harm that you've experienced? And so we need to be asking from the very outset, like, does a particular group or student have anxiety because their comfortable way of life is threatened, or because their actual survival is threatened? And when you approach it that way, it forces us to confront the entire story of climate colonialism and the structure of environmental racism at the heart of the crisis. And, I think, in terms of the like white climate anxiety, this is another one where we need to make it really clear. This can go one of two ways, that sort of distress that people feel can be channeled towards recognizing climate change comes from and exacerbates racism, and therefore addressing one requires addressing the other. But then in other cases, we see how climate anxiety leads towards fear and othering, and these rising incidences of ecofascism, the mass shootings in Buffalo and El Paso and Christchurch, where the shooter said it was in response to ethnic invasion, overpopulation, environmental degradation. And like Ann Coulter has tweeted that Republicans should get behind climate change because it's a way to clamp down on borders. So there are all these kind of histories, and before climate change as well, and the environmental movement, where it's just so imperative that educators and students are aware, like, if racism is at the root of the climate crisis, then more racism doesn't fix it. And so there was a great article that you brought to mind in some of the, it was a real accessible one, so I wanted to use it for students. It was in Salon, and it was by Joseph Henderson, who's a social scientist, and he was talking about, how the Buffalo shooter actually believed he was helping save the planet. And so this is what happens when eco-anxiety kind of moves into a direction that, we tend to think that if we teach people about climate change, they want to create a world that's more just and peaceful. But that's really ideologically naive, that there are many that will take it in directions that are racist and anti-democratic and authoritarian. So, people are just going to integrate it into their existing politics. So if we're in this moment where we're fomenting so much fear, we need to think about how the consequences of that can play out in unexpected ways.
Okay.
Thank you. That's such a great answer.
Yeah.
Amanda and then Catherine have questions. Amanda?
Hi, Jennifer, thank you so much for your talk. Very promising work, and I'm excited that you're addressing climate anxiety on an academic level. Quick question. I don't know if you've already said it. When can we expect this book on shelves? When can we buy it and use this toolkit?
I just asked our editor for a to extend our deadline. So, I thought it was going to be in like 1 year from now. I think it still might be. But as we all know, the whole process of the peer review and the production is laborious. And I would feel more hopeful if I didn't have 30 contributors. I would say this is going to depend on whether I can get 30 contributors to meet all the deadlines and fill out the paperwork and have their citations in order. So I think right now the press has said spring of 2024. So could be a little later than that, but keep our fingers crossed.
Okay, Catherine.
Hi, I was invited to this by my friend Joey Key, who's a professor in the physics department at UW-Bothell. I live in Alabama, so thank you for having me. But yeah, I'm an astronomy and physics educator like Joey. We went to grad school together. And I've gotten involved. I'm a member of Astronomers for Planet Earth, which is astronomers, trying to redirect focus on our home. And I've been doing a lot more with climate education in the past few years. Specifically when I worked as a professor in West Virginia. I just recently moved to Alabama. So one of the things we did, and we have a paper coming out about it in the Journal of Sustainability Education, we did some teacher professional development. So I just put a link into our project in the chat.
Oh, cool.
But one of the things that we're really missing from that sort of professional development is the feelings, the emotions, the environmental justice side of it is really missing. And since I've moved to Alabama, the future of that project in itself is a little bit uncertain, but I'm trying to figure out how to keep it going and make it more of an Appalachian thing, like Alabama to West Virginia. And I don't know, I'm putting a link to my, I started my own consulting company to try to be independent doing this. And I'm actually contracting with NASA right now in Alabama and Energy Alabama. And they're both really interested in doing more around this with teacher education. So I'd love to just find ways to collaborate. And I also am just like really jealous. I just wanted to mention I'm really jealous of you all for being in such a liberal area where you can say all of these things, because that's not the case in West Virginia and Alabama.
Yeah.
We are still trying to convince people that climate change is real and human caused. I know you all are beyond that. Most of the world is. I've had my European colleagues and Astronomers for Planet Earth question why I'm still shouting this fight, but it is the reality. So, any ways that we can connect and, push on that reality a little bit would be great. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I know we're kind of out of time. I don't want to bleed into the other presenters, but Catherine, I'll drop my email in the chat. And if you want to follow up with me, I can send you some other just like real concrete resources that are available now. You don't have to wait for next year for the book. It'd be fun to hear about your work as well. But thank you for fighting the good fight in areas that are still resistance to that. And I'm sorry that's going to be incredibly hard as an educator to be teaching in that kind of climate.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd love to email you.
Yeah,
I'm actually incredibly interested in this conversation and don't, people shouldn't hold back if there's another question. It's really fine with me.
Given that's the opinion of our next speaker, if you have more comments to make about that, Jennifer, please feel free. And if someone else has a question, please ask it.
Well, I guess what comes to mind, it's something that one of the most common questions that I get when I do talks is like, how do I talk to climate deniers? How do I talk to my uncle that is dismissing this? And you're right when you say we are teaching and working together in communities here where there's just that level of resistance is not anywhere near as pervasive as what I hear from folks coming from other areas. And so I don't have as much personal experience with it, but I don't know if you're familiar with Catherine Hayhoe's new book, Saving Us. I mean, great, right? So she's like an evangelical Christian speaking to evangelical Christians, and she's a climate scientist, like very prominent. And I think it is extremely important, and all of the research on climate communication says this, is like climate, belief is more about trust and the messenger than it is about the facts, right? Like you cannot have Al Gore going into those communities and giving his talk. It really needs to come from people who identify with that other person as a trusted messenger. And so, Catherine Hayhoe has got so many resources out there now, I think, for folks that are in those areas to kind of think about, also kind of starting with questions and connections. And Renee Lertzman is another one that talks about using informational interviewing in these conversations rather than starting where, we've all been starting for so many decades in the past, which is just kind of like hammering people with the facts and the data, because it's like, look at this, how could you argue with the data? But again, that goes back to that information deficit model that just doesn't work. And I'm sure you already know this. So I guess that's another resource I would really look at, are both of those. Renee Lertzman, and what is her book? Oh, the book Environmental Melancholia by Renee Lertzman. This was like her original book that came out. She was doing really extensive research up in the Great Lakes region with kind of working class communities that were actually directly being harmed by environmental pollution from the industry in that area. And it's an interesting psychological study about the resistance that folks feel who are yet on the front lines and their bodies are being harmed, the most. This was specifically white communities, working class kind of communities in the former auto industries up there in Michigan. But it's just a fascinating case study on on repression and the way that these emotions of sort of like guilt and distrust and resistance end up getting expressed in something that looks to us like denial, but actually is not about denial. It's about something else. So that might be another one that would be very telling for, I think, the area that you're working in. I'll drop that in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, I think this is a good time to transition to our next presentation. It's called Periscope Video Lessons, Looking into Learning and Best Practices Physics Classrooms. And it's by Dr. Rachel Scher, Dr. Blakely Surasaki, and Dr. Rejoice Akapami. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Scher.
Hi, so I'm delighted to get the chance to speak about this project. And what Jennifer and I have in common, I guess, is that we're both talking about, collections of lessons intended to improve the teaching of something, okay? The lessons that I'll be speaking about are intended to improve the teaching and learning of especially physics, although some of the application is STEM-wide. So can I advance my slide? Yes. So Periscope, it's a collection of video-based lessons to connect authentic events from best practices STEM classrooms to big